今天邀请到我们阿格斯公司的2位专家来为大家来分享。首先我要介绍我们阿格斯公司我们华大威副总裁，他是我们阿格斯公司北亚区商务拓展的副总裁，同时他也是日本的代表。他为我们来介绍一下阿格斯公司。我们非常欢迎华大威副总裁。And also Ryan. Ryan will also give us a speech later on for the global perspective. Thank you very much. Have you on the stage?
上午好，今天很荣幸，代表阿格斯有机会跟大家分享一下我们是怎么看待这个大宗商品和这个谷物市场的一些问题。对，可能有人没听说阿格斯这个名称，所以我的小部分就是简单的解释一下我们公司的情况啊。接下来我的同事 Ryan 会上台，就是跟大家讲一下一些若干问题。可能有些人还没听说阿格斯这家公司名，所以呢，我简单的介绍一下我们的公司的概况。简单的说，我们阿格斯 Argus 是专门从事全球大宗商品市场的价格指数的工作和市场分析。那么我们是所谓的 PRA，就是 Price Reporting Agency。那么 PRA 它跟其他的传统的媒体是不一样的，像这个 Bloomberg 或者 Reuters， 我们是专门做大宗商品这方面的一些工作。那么我们所覆盖的这些大宗商品，包括传统的原油，还有这个金属啊、钢铁，这个石化学品等等。我们里面也有一个团队，就是那个 Ryan 也是来自我们的这个农业产品的团队，是做这个市场分析的。好，那么在这个图呢，我就是想给大家展示一下我们在农业，尤其是在这个谷类谷物方面的所覆盖的一些工作。那我们公司，因为我们是搞信息的，我们是信息公司，我们每天、每周、每月会发布一些比较有代表性的全球的一些价格点，包括我在这里就是给大家看一下我们的这个玉米这方面的一些价格点，主要的比较有代表性的市场，包括美国墨西哥湾的一个基准价啊，还有这个 FOB 乌克兰的出口价等等。所以此后呢，大家有机会的话，欢迎您看一下我们的网站。那么我们公司在服务方面，我们所提供的服务包括这个实时的新闻，还有这个周报、月报，还有咨询，会长也在做。那么我阿格斯有大概50多年的历史了。本来我们是做这个原有的，就慢慢就把我们的所覆盖的范围扩到在农业产品里面。全球有大概有30多个代表处，员工是1500多人。我公司就是坚持一些基本的原则，就是我是说在进行价格的评估、价格指数的工作的时候，对于我们来说，我们有3个很重要的价值观。第一是中立性的，中立性对信息公司特别重要。为什么呢？因为我们不中立的话，我们的客户不会认可我们，不会信任我们。所以呢，我们所发布的这个信息一定要做那个中立的，也要客观的，当然要诚实的。我们也有一个使命，我们的使命简单的说，就是照明市场的真相。这是什么意思呢？就是说我们努力要提高整个市场的透明度，就是通过提供实时的准确的信息来提高这个市场的这个透明度。这样的话，也可以增强市场本身的运转的效率。接下来那么我刚才提到了，我们发布一些不同的指数，只是基准价。那么市场参与者是怎么利用我们的价格呢？主要有3个不同的方式。第一个就是说，他们在进行现货交易的时候， 我在这里我指的是实货的价格，不是像这个 CME 那边的期货的价格，实货的现货的价格。他们进行这种现货交易的时候，他们会参考我们的价格，有的时候他们做一种所谓的浮动价格一个公式，把我们的价格作为这个基础，然后加上一个贴水。还有另外一个用法是说，卖方和买方做一个长期的合约的时候，那个很多可能尤其是在能源这方面，有很多长期的合约，他们用我们公司的这个月均的平均的价格作为基础，再加个贴水。最后呢，有一些期货交易所包括 CME 是我们的伙伴还有这个纽约的，还有这个新加坡的，在用我们的一些这个实货的价格作为他们的期货的这种清算的参考工具。这个很重要，因为期货的这个合同，它主要的用途在于减低你的风险，就是说针对属下的这个实货价格的变动的这个不可预料的变动的这个风险，所以呢，需要用的是一个比较有代表性的准确的一个价格。那么在下面我简单的列了一些案例包括我刚才提到了原油 WTI 原油价，也是我阿格斯的所发布的价格。最近也一些新加坡交易所也开始用我们的亚洲的安水的基准价，还有这个金属方面，煤炭呢，钢铁都有了。最后我的部分很快会结束的最后的一个板块对我们阿克斯来说，这个所谓的合规 compliance 非常的重要，因为我刚才提到了我们是信息公司，这个就是大家信任我们，就是认可我们是非常重要的。不知道大家有没有听说过 IOSCO， 它是一种国际的一个协会。那么我们遵守 IOSCO 的这个合规标准，这个意思是说，我们每年我们的编辑的一些分析师，包括 Ryan，要受这个审核，然后这个 Pricewaterhouse 他们给我们做一个审核，就是确保我们所发布的这个信息和价格都是准确的，也是按照我们的这个方法论来做的。那好，那我的部分就结束了。下面我请我的同事 Ryan， 就是给大家讲一讲这个全球的这个玉米市场的概况。谢谢。
Thank you, David, and thank you to the U.S. Grains Council and all of you for having us out here today. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come before you and talk about what we're seeing within the U.S. and global corn market. So, jumping right on into it, as everyone here knows, and I'm sure we've all discussed, the USDA last Friday threw us a curveball. And in that, they reduced U.S. corn yields pretty substantially. Second largest reduction, second largest change for a January report in the history of the WASDE. Now, it's not uncommon for the January WASDE to have a downward revision in corn yields. It's generally kind of considered the last major revision for corn yields for USDA projections. However, the magnitude of the drop was somewhat unexpected. What we were looking at before, looking at the December WASDE, is somewhere about 183 bushels per acre, which following last year's production, there was a lot of reasons to think that we were going to have such strong yields. You heard our farmers discuss in terms of some of the conditions that they had growing. Ohio, things were a little less favorable. But overall, we actually had a relatively good planting window. Things were mostly on pace. We had excellently timed rains for the majority of the growing area. You know, when we talk about agriculture, it's more true when weather happens is important than what weather happens. And what we had was an absolutely perfect interval of nice wet conditions over the major growing and pollinating period, July into early August. And then once we started getting into the late August and into September, into October, things became exceedingly dry. And with that dryness, what we saw was moisture levels coming off the fields were actually very low, 2 to 3% below typical levels. Now, as I reflect back on the WASDE's change in terms of yields, in some ways, we should have probably seen it coming. And maybe the question we should be asking ourselves isn't, why did they reduce it down to 179.3? Why did they cut 4 bushels per acre off? Maybe the question we should be asking is, why did they not do it sooner? Whenever we read the WASDE report and the justifications that they provided for the lower yield estimate, they basically said test weights were down. Well, you heard the U.S. Grains Council representative discuss the fact that actually test weights were fairly positive, above where they are from a historical perspective. So if that's not genuinely the catalyst behind why yields are lower, there's something else in there. And we knew corn was dry, and there aren't many factors that we should have been surprised by that should have resulted in a 2% plus drop in yields. So I guess kind of a long-winded way of saying, those of you who proactively bought corn this past fall from the US, you should write the USDA a thank you letter, because essentially they handed you a weaker market than was probably really there. Whenever the USDA WASDE report came out last Friday, the moment that it came out, the front month for corn futures on the CME jumped about 11 cents per bushel, and I think it finished about 17 cents per bushel higher on the day. We'll see how things crack out once it opens up again in the coming day. Maybe we'll see it retract back a little bit. But the reality is, we were probably looking at a 179.3 bushel the whole time. And that's not a bad bushel. It's still a record high yield. It's slightly below trend, but it's still a record high yield. It's just not 183.1, which we probably weren't there in the first place. The other thing that this does is it really changes what we're talking about for a beginning point for the US corn market. Because whenever we had that 183 bushel, we were talking about a market in which total supply, production plus beginning stocks for US corn was up about 5 million bushels from the, or 5 million metric tons rather, from the prior year. With this real yield revision, we are now down about 2 million metric tons. So it's about a 7 million metric ton swing. We went from being longer in supply year over year to actually being tighter in supply year over year in the course of one report. And so it's a little bit funny because as I was preparing these slides and preparing to come out to speak with you all, I actually thought there was a fair amount of potential for upward price pressure within the US corn market. And that's really based on risks around demand. I really had not anticipated this supply shock to come in and make me right for the wrong reasons. However, all this said, the factors that I'm going to talk about in terms of demand potentially being a factor to create higher prices are now escalated because we're starting with these demand factors that will likely lead to price pressure on top of a tighter supply basis in the US. Pivoting just briefly to the two other major issues developing within global corn supply outlook and looking at South America. Whenever we look at Brazil and Argentina, we have an okay corn crop there at the moment, but they're trending in negative directions for actually two different reasons. Whenever we look at Argentina, we're continuing to have persistent drought and drought that's intensifying. And as the corn crop stands right now, the BAG-A report that the Buenos Aires Grain Exchange publishes, they continue to rate the Argentine corn crop slightly better than last year, but it's dropping by percentage points each and every week. And so we're probably trending towards a point in which the Argentine corn crop is going to wind up weaker than last year by the time we get farther down the road. Brazil, it's a little early to say because we're starting to get into January corn planting, but unlike dryness, our situation seems to be wet. We're having too much rain. And with that rain, we're delaying the soybean harvest. And with that delay in the soybean harvest, it's delaying our ability to get in and plant corn following the soybean. We're at the very beginning of it, right? And weather's a very fickle thing. Things can change within the terms of a week, and there's enough tractors out there and combines out there that you can catch up that planting pace very quickly. But the trends are right now, we've got dry conditions that are hampering the development of the Argentine crop. We've got wet conditions that are hampering the planting of the Brazilian crop. And so from those two directions, we have supply risk, which means that we might see less production out of Latin America, South America, than we're currently anticipating. And just to kind of maybe beleaguer the point on Argentina a little bit more, a little bit of the peril of relying on the USDA for all of your data is, as you guys have seen, the USDA doesn't always get things right the first crack. And so as Argus, we actually produce our own internal estimates for where we think the supply and utilization balance for global grains is going to be. Currently, we're looking at a situation in which we think Argentina's corn production is going to be down just a little bit year over year, basically following these weaker production trends. However, as we're seeing this drought conditions develop, we put together what we think is a worst case scenario for Argentine drought, in which we see yields drop compared to last year. If we see this drought condition continue to intensify and we see it really eat into the crop along the trends that it's doing now, that could result in a 9 million metric ton swing in terms of what Argentina production would be relative to where the current projections are. So just to kind of keep a risk factor and to keep an eye on Argentina as we move forward in these drought conditions, it's a pretty substantial amount of the global supply that could be in the balance with Argentina. So now getting back into where I think the real risks in this market are, and that's around demand. So just to kind of get one factor out of the way to begin with, and I know it's a major factor for many people, but whenever we're discussing U.S. corn, it's not as large of an element, and that's China. Now, China, it is true, is a major purchaser of corn and grains globally, but they actually don't purchase very much corn, if any, really at all, from the U.S. anymore. In addition to that, what we're seeing develop in China is a very weak domestic demand market. The two prices we watch for China are an inland price and we watch a FOB port price for corn. In the inland price, you can see basically the parity between the two, domestic versus importer, has been collapsing. And that's because domestic demand is very weak. As we've seen that collapse, you can see that China's corn imports have continued to shrink down. The global demand footprint coming out of China is weakening, and it's not likely to be a big factor for driving prices going forward into this next year. And we're not just talking corn. We're talking pretty much all of the grains that China imports. Effectively, we are in a situation in which the risk for China coming in and really driving prices one way or another in the near term is relatively minimal because they're not in a position to be buying much grain off the global market. Domestically, they seem to be pretty well satisfied with stock levels, and demand is not growing at a very robust pace, pushing down on their need to import grain. So we don't see a tremendous amount of risk coming out of China in terms of where we think prices are going to go for corn. And this works double too whenever we discuss some of the political risk within the United States right now, right? As we look to the new presidential administration coming in and some of the discussions that we've heard regarding tariffs and counter tariffs, particularly whenever President-elect Donald Trump threatens to implement 25, 50, 60% tariffs and the potential for counter tariffs, not a big risk when we're talking about corn because it's not likely going to drive much purchasing decision between the U.S. and China with corn. However, that is not to say that there's not risk with corn exports. And one of the things that we're seeing within corn exports, and this is the conversation I was prepared to have, is we actually think the current projection from the USDA underestimate the amount of upward pressure we're getting off of prices from exports. If we look at the pace of corn exports, and particularly corn exports relative to the WASDE, you can see that back in the December WASDE, they've actually upgraded the export expectations for corn because we were running at a very high level. The graph on the right here is export sales as a share of WASDE projections. And you can see that we are running about 8% over the 5-year average, well above last year, which implies that if we were to adjust WASDE's export expectations to match that pace, that adds about 5 to 6 million metric tons to exports over where WASDE's at now. Now, do we think that entire 5 to 6 is going to come in? Potentially not. It's very likely that what we're seeing is front-loading behavior on exports ahead of any potential risk on trade. But what's interesting is if that's the case, you can see that we have actually increased our export commitments, the amount that we've sold. We're sitting almost 9 million metric tons over where we were last year. That's a pretty heavy clip in terms of export commitments. But the pace of exports coming out of the United States, actually outstanding exports, the amount that's been bought that's sitting in the United States, is well above where we were last year. We're almost 10 million metric tons above where we were last year. So yes, we've seen strong purchasing behavior, but we haven't actually seen it translate into a high amount of corn leaving the United States. In fact, there's a lot still sitting there waiting to be shipped out. And if you look at the chief purchasers, you can see the top of the list right there is Mexico with 15.27 million metric tons of corn that they've purchased from the U.S. so far this year. A lot of that standing balance that's yet to be exported, that's going to Mexico. And in some ways, this is probably a more salient risk than when we discussed China with regard to trade. Again, because we're not really trading that much corn with China. You can see that China so far has bought 30,000 metric tons, almost nothing from the United States. One of the things that we've heard in terms of political rhetoric coming out of the incoming presidential candidate or elect is he wants to effectively levy a 25% tariff against both Canada and against Mexico. If he does that, there's always the risk of counter tariffs. If we get in a situation in which we have tariffs and counter tariffs, and we do get tariffs against corn, Mexico is our largest purchaser of corn, and they have a lot of corn that they've bought that they have not shipped. That corn could get canceled. If that corn gets canceled, all of a sudden that becomes supply again on the U.S. balance sheet, and that creates a lot of downward price risk for the U.S. market. I think that risk, though, is actually fairly minor. And the reason I say that is when you look at opportunities for Mexico to potentially replace any canceled corn shipments, they don't have a lot of opportunities. They buy 80 to 90% of their corn from the United States because it's very easy to get it to Mexico from the U.S. You can put it on a rail car, you can ship it across the border. It's a very cheap way of transporting it. You can put it down on a barge, send it down the Mississippi, send it across the Gulf. It's hard for Mexico to replace that supply for cheaper than they can get it from the United States. Even if we do see a tariff situation, effectively you're talking about bringing corn all the way up from Brazil if they get rid of the United States as a supplier. And that's if we do have a tariff situation manifest itself, which we may not do. Even if we do see tariffs levied, there's always a chance they won't be placed against agricultural goods. So my general assessment in terms of the import risk is I think the USDA is understating how much we're going to export this year in terms of corn, particularly given the pace that we've seen so far. Yes, there is risk that we could see tariffs materialize, and we could see that lead to cancellations by Mexico, that back into the United States and start adding downward pressure on price. I think that risk is fairly marginal. And so in general, I think despite the incoming presidential situation and despite the conversation around tariffs, the actual risk with imports is towards the bullish side with regard to prices. And just to kind of highlight a comparison here and a bit of a contrast, as we discussed, China doesn't really buy corn from the United States anymore. They absolutely still buy soybeans. And what's interesting is you can see outstanding export sales. They are the opposite of what we've seen in corn. Unlike corn, where we've seen heavy purchases, yet it's still sitting at the United States, in the US, waiting to be exported, the pace of soybean exports has been very aggressive. This absolutely looks like front-loading behavior. It looks like there is the threat and the perceived risk within China of some kind of trade relationship developing and China levying counter duties against US soybeans. As a result, you can see Chinese sales, they're basically on par with last year. Actually, from marketing year perspective, they're down a little bit. The amount of corn we have left to ship out is below last year, or soybeans rather, is below last year. So we could see some kind of risk there with soybeans, but the amount that's left to be shipped out is down enough, and the pace of exports so far has been protective against that, that again, I think the risk there within the near term is fairly muted. Most of our sales, or what we're going to make for the year, have already been committed. Most of the sales that we've made have already been exported. It leaves a small amount that could be canceled or could be changed based on tariffs within the next marketing year. Turning to the other factor that we think is going to change the demand side on this and potentially create increased price risk towards the bullish side is what we see going on within the ethanol markets. And ethanol markets were a little bit sleepy there for a few years, and that's changed over the past 2 years. Really what we've seen is, not necessarily within the US, but within foreign markets, particularly looking at Canada, looking at the UK, looking at India, they've all started to advance more aggressive domestic ethanol policies. Looking at the projections for both Brazil and India in terms of the level of ethanol production and corn use that they're projecting, we're looking for a substantial increase in corn consumption domestically from those two countries as they start to advance their ethanol programs. And what we've seen in the near term is the pace of US ethanol exports has been very strong. And with that strong pace of exports, the actual use of corn for ethanol production has been very robust. And again, if we compare that to where WASDE is, right, and what WASDE is calling for the use for ethanol within the United States, basically through the first 3 months, 4 months of this marketing year, our corn use for ethanol is up 33% from where it was over the same interval last year. And last year was up 56% from the prior year. We're using a lot of corn for U.S. ethanol production to satisfy foreign demand. It's being shipped out. With that, we're probably going to see that trend continue because this doesn't really get caught in that whole conversation around tariffs on corn because it's being turned into ethanol and it's going to satisfy other countries' programs. There are programs that they need on a government level that are being advocated to expand the use of biofuels. So it falls outside of the agriculture sphere altogether. That when we start kind of shaping up, oh, you can't see my green. Well, look at the side ones. Maybe they look a little bit better. Whenever we kind of shape up where we see the market and the potential risks around the market right now, this is based on the December WASDE, kind of cracking this out into a bullish and bearish risk. You know, I think whenever we look at bullish risks, things stack up a little bit more. Domestic ethanol production, as of the December WASDE, the USDA had it at about 139, almost 140 million metric tons. In all honesty, given the pace that we're using right now, and given the fact that we're likely to see exports continue, there's a very real chance the WASDE is going to be revising up ethanol use by about 2 million metric tons by the time we get to this marketing year. On the export side as well, as I mentioned, given the pace of exports relative to historic norms, there is a chance that the WASDE could revise up as much as 5 or 6 million metric tons to kind of bring that back into a more normal range. If we only have half of that, say 2 million metric tons, basically what that does is that ups your use numbers, it tightens your ending stocks and brings you down to about a 10.34 stock to use ratio, which is substantially more bearish, or bullish rather, than the 11.4 that they were calling for as of December. Looking at the bearish risk, I think there's a lot less. We could see a situation in which exports start to suffer due to trade relationships and due to tariffs and counter tariffs. But as I mentioned, I don't really think there's a lot of opportunity for that. You know, the biggest risk there is Mexico. And the reality is Mexico is not likely to cancel a lot of corn and buy it from somewhere else because A, I don't think we're going to have tariffs levied against ag products. And even if they do, it's going to be difficult for Mexico to replace that supply from anywhere but the United States. So I don't think we're going to see much loss on the export side. I think the bearish risk there is fairly minor. And then to add to that, let's take into context the January WASDE. If we look at what the January WASDE did, they cut back production, which definitely helped to tighten up that stocks to use ratio. Now the WASDE is calling for a 10.19. You know, I was calling it 10.40 a minute ago, a little bit more bullish. Well, they're down to a 10.19 already. If we take that 10.19 and we look at they reduced feed and residual use a little bit, to me, I think what they're trying to do there is compensate for some of the higher feed costs and maybe some of that reduced production to keep that ending stock level a little more digestible. They cut back exports a little bit, but not very much. So ultimately, your stock levels fell pretty substantially by about 5 million metric tons. Your stock to use ratio went up. If we take those same risk factors I was discussing before in terms of ethanol use and in terms of where we think exports are going, and we apply it to where the WASDE is now, that pulls your stock to use ratio all the way down to a 9. That is much more bullish for corn. And so whenever we look at where the USDA is now putting production, and that's unlikely to change by much going forward, if we look at the pace of both domestic ethanol or corn use for ethanol and what we are looking at for the pace of exports, on the demand side, there's more bullish pressure in there. So as we look at the market going forward, I think that's the biggest risk that we're looking at is potentially higher prices. You know, and one area that we could potentially see this back in and actually provide some bearish pressure is once we get into planting this year. You know, as we discussed with soybeans, we're talking about a situation in which we could see a degradation in trade if relationships with China fall apart. If we see that, we'll see weaker prices for soybeans in the U.S. That could induce more acres going into corn. From a supply side, you start to see some downward pressure once we get into next fall. And maybe just to kind of round out with one other policy point I meant to cover in my biofuel slides, but I kind of forgot about it, is just last week, adding to the things that the U.S. government has provided us to create risks, they finally passed some guidance around the 45Z tax credit. I'm not sure how much you guys are familiar with the 45Z tax credit, but within the U.S. biofuel policy, under the Inflation Reduction Act, they've reshaped the way that they incentivize biofuel production in the United States. Historically, it's been managed through blender's credit. Whenever you buy and you blend biofuels, you get a credit. That credit gets bid back into the system. That's all changed. The credits are now a direct producer's credit. These credits are being based on the feedstock that's being used to create that biofuel. And these feedstocks are being evaluated based on their greenhouse gas contributions using what's called the GREET model. And I'd have to look up what the acronym stands for. I don't remember off the top of my head. I've been told Jim knows a whole lot more about this than myself, so maybe ask him questions over lunch. But here's where we get a lot of uncertainty from what the U.S. government handed us last week. The IRS finally came through and they gave us some guidance in terms of how they're going to apply this credit. But they left two big holes. Number one, so far, a lot of the Z45 or 45Z credit has been satisfied and production has been satisfied through the use of used cooking oil, primarily imported from China. With the announcement last week, the IRS said that they're not going to let used cooking oil satisfy that criteria going forward until further review. Okay, so does that mean used cooking oil is a feedstock for this or not? We don't know. If it's not, then you're likely to see a lot more soybean oil go into that supply chain. The other thing that they did not tell us is if they're going to use climate smart ag criteria to justify higher greenhouse gas reductions for U.S. agricultural produced feedstocks. So we don't know how they're going to evaluate imported feedstocks. We don't know how they're going to evaluate domestically produced feedstocks. We do know that there's a very large subsidy for biofuel production in the United States going forward. We just don't know what we're allowed to make that biofuel out of to be able to get that credit. So all this will be decided by the Trump administration because it's all under 90-day review, which means that we're not going to know anything until we get into March at the earliest, probably April. Over the next 90 days, Trump is going to be behind the decision-making process there. And my take would be you're very likely to see imported feedstock from China find an unhappy candidate there in terms of advocacy for using used cooking oil. You're probably going to see pressure to make the GREET model a little more amicable towards domestically produced feedstocks. And so that could mean you're going to have even more bullish pressure under prices to go into this biofuel feedstock program under the new 45Z tax credit. Maybe. We don't know. It's all under review. So again, a huge point of risk. But I think whenever we stack up all these points of risks, particularly when we discuss U.S. corn, the risks tend to lean towards the bullish side. I think there's more potential for use in this market going forward. And now we're starting with an even smaller domestic supply position. All factors I think are going to lead to increased price pressure on corn going forward. Thank you very much.
非常谢谢我们Ryan 精彩的演讲，大家应该听到很多这个 inside information。